Hello, this is Brett Etheridge, founder of Dominate the GMAT, here with your GMAT Tip of the Week. I'd like to share with you a really useful GMAT tip, and specifically a tip that concerns GMAT critical reasoning questions. And I'm going to share that with you in a second, but I'd actually like you to try your hand at this question first. This is the question that we'll apply the tip to. So I'd like you to familiarize yourself with it, and I'd actually like you to try to solve it. So go ahead and press pause, see how you do, and then we're going to come back and talk about it together. Go ahead and press pause. All right, how'd you do? Well, let me start by telling you the tip. The tip on GMAT critical reasoning questions is always to try to boil down the statement into very, very simple summary sentences. And you can use your scratch paper for that. In other words, I want you to take the text that can sometimes be a little bit convoluted, and I want you to break it down into the bare bones, absolute simplest terms in terms of summarizing the three most crucial parts of any argument. And I always teach my students that you always want to start first with the conclusion. Can you clearly identify what the conclusion is? And then what is that conclusion based on? Well, it's based on one or several premises. And then eventually you're going to want to figure out and put in your own words what the assumption is. And we know that usually the correct answer lies in your ability to identify the assumption. But when we look at this statement, or when we look at this argument rather, what's the conclusion? Well, it says what? It says if we could all decrease our body fat to that level. So anytime you see kind of an if-then type of a statement, the then portion of it is usually going to be the conclusion, right? If such and such and such and such, that by definition is going to be a premise, then what? Well, then the conclusion. Then we could all be world-class cyclists, right? So the conclusion is going to be something like that. Well, based on what? Based on what premises? Based on the fact that we see this going on, right? Between 4 and 11% body fat. Okay, hold that thought. What we want to do, and the tip is, let's boil those down into very, very simple statements, because it's kind of hard to get your mind around what's going on to be able to answer the question if you don't first understand in the simplest terms what actually the conclusion is. And here's what I mean by that. As a reminder, now if you haven't gone through my course yet, or you haven't gone through my lesson on GMAT critical reasoning, I encourage you to, but let's take a look at kind of this summary of how to tackle these types of questions. You know, the first thing to notice is that we are dealing with a causal argument. Now, there are a number of different argument patterns. I'm just going to be talking about causal arguments for a second because that's the type of question we're looking at. Certainly, you're going to want to familiarize yourself with all of the other argument patterns. But the pattern in general is as follows. We see two things happening together, A and B, and we're concluding that A causes B. And then there are going to be some assumptions that flow from that. Well, let's go back to our argument. That is exactly how on your scratch paper you want to synthesize this, right? What's the premise? Well, the premise of any conclusion argument or causal type of an argument is that we see two things happening together. And in this case, what do we have? We see body fat. So low body fat, I'm just going to kind of draw it like this. This is probably how you would do it on your scratch paper. Low body fat and world-class WCC, right? World-class cyclists, those things are happening together, right? We're seeing those things kind of happening at the same time, right? And that's exactly what the causal argument pattern looks like, right? Back here, what do we see? A and B occur together, and that's what we're saying. So I'm just synthesizing that on my scratch paper. We have touring cyclists, and they have low body fat. Okay, so that's the premise. Now, what are we concluding from that? It's a causal conclusion, isn't it? It says that we would all be world-class cyclists if we could decrease our body fat. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Put that in your own words. The author is concluding that A causes B, right? And specifically that low body fat causes, with an arrow, causes you to be a professional cyclist. Isn't that what it's implying? By saying that you can, by reducing your body fat, you're going to become a professional cyclist, it's saying that A causes B. It's putting the cart before the horse. Now that may or may not be okay, but there's clearly something being assumed, right? Does it stand to reason that that's going to be the case? I mean, what if you go on the craziest diet in the whole world, you exercise like crazy, but you have some sort of disease where you have dizziness and you can't even ride a bicycle? Well, just because you have low body fat doesn't mean you're going to be a professional cyclist, right? So what am I assuming? Well, now we go back to our pattern. We're assuming one of two things. Either that we have the directionality correct and that A actually causes B and it's not the other way around, that B doesn't cause A, right? Or that there's not something else entirely going on, some confounding factor we're talking about that's actually causing it. Because remember the rule in statistics, correlation does not equal causation. So let's go back to our argument. Just because we see these two things together, the flaw in the argument is that two things that are correlated don't actually necessarily have a causal effect. Does that make sense? And so that's what's going on. And so that, again, is our assumption, and we might want to write that out on our paper, that B doesn't cause A. How do we know that it's not being a professional cyclist that's actually causing the low body fat, right? Well, that stands to reason, because if you're bicycling, 5 hours a day, of course you're going to have low body fat, right? So how do we know we have the directionality correct, or how do we know that there's not something else going on? That these guys have unbelievable lung capacity, or extra large hearts, or a different type of work ethic than the average person, or great teamwork, or right, there could be 1,000 other things that in addition to body fat percentage could be going on here. Okay, all of that to say, this is the tip. You want to boil it down into the simplest possible terms on your scratch paper, because it helps illustrate what you need to determine to be able to answer the question. And hopefully now that we've done that, you'll see when we look at these statements, statement number 1, is it a flaw to assume that it's assuming a causal relationship between two highly correlated events? Absolutely. What did we say? Well, we said there's a rule. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and that's exactly what it's doing. So that would be an accurate description of a flaw. Number 2, it suggests that low body fat is a sufficient condition. In other words, that alone, it certainly might be helpful to have low body fat, but there's other things going on, right? But this is assuming that that alone is enough, because it's saying that if you get your body fat low enough, you will be a world-class cyclist. How do we know that that's the conclusion? Because we summarize that on our scratch paper, that low body fat alone causes, i.e. is sufficient to cause you to be a professional cyclist. Again, that's the benefit of having summarized it, broken it down into its bare bones essential components. And that proves to us, again, that statement number 2 is a flaw. Number 3, that its conclusion is based on evidence. Okay, well, that's true. The conclusion is based on two things that we see, right? The evidence, the premise that we see those things together, which in turn is based on a conclusion. That's where it falls apart, right? The two things kind of being correlated isn't based on this conclusion, so statement number 3 actually doesn't make any sense. So when we look at the answer choices, only answer choice C is correct. Then statement number 1 and statement number 2 are correct. So I hope this is helpful. Again, the tip is to take sometimes the convoluted type of wording in an argument and break it down. Use letters if you need to. A causes B, B causes A is correlated with B. Learn the other patterns of argument that I teach in my critical reasoning lessons, but make sure that you're able to synthesize the arguments, and it really helps to use your scratch paper to put it into very basic sentences, clearly summarizing what's going on, and it will help to illustrate exactly what's going on in the argument to find the correct answer. So, I hope you have found this tip valuable. For more great GMAT tips, visit our blog at dominathegmat.com and go out and dominate the GMAT.